Well, today in our conversation, I want to pick up where we left off. We began to look at the beginning of chapter 5 in James. The last few days we've talked about some kind of abstract concepts, the things about, is there a moral certitude in the world? Is there a clear sense of right and wrong? And is there an absolute truth? And then the question is how do I apply that truth in various situations? And what are some of the dangers that we fall into? But now I want to move on here in verse 1 because he deals specifically with one area that a lot of people struggle to know where the balance is found between good and evil. And it's dealing with riches, where he says in verse 1 of chapter 5, "Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming upon you." Well, I think that we had to first deal with the issue. Is it simply wrong? Is it sinful to be rich? Because some people have read this and concluded that this means that if you have wealth, you're a bad person. And one of the things I think is really goes against that is the fact that we find that many people in scriptures were very wealthy, whether we're talking about Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, or Joseph, or David, even people in the New Testament, like Nicodemus Simon of Arimathea. We're told in the Talmud that they were two of the richest men in Jerusalem in those days. And we know that there were very many wealthy women who actually contributed to not only Jesus' ministry and the support of what he did, but they also were really key in helping to support the early churches. Many churches met in the homes of wealthy converts like Lydia. So the idea that someone has wealth it immediately implies that they are sinful, or the idea that they are wealthy because they got it illegally is kind of a concept that's being twisted. We talk about twisting of ideas and twisting of values and truths. That's one of those things that gets twisted because there are many people who are wealthy, but they are also extremely mindful of the fact that that wealth was a gift from God. And in fact, when Paul in Romans 12 speaks about somebody who has a gift of giving, you have to get before you can give. And I'm pretty sure in the context, he's talking about people who have become physically and financially responsible and successful, who are able therefore to give those resources in a judicious way to various needs and causes that they see. So when we talk about this whole concept of being riches, we have to understand that this was a problem even in Jesus' time, because in first century rabbinical Judaism, they basically believed that wealth and health were evidences of God's blessings, and that sickness or disease and poverty were the evidence of God's judgment. So quite literally, many amongst the Pharisees and the Sadducees would look at the poor man, the leper, the man who was demon-possessed or whatever, and say, well, obviously this person isn't loved by God because they're living this decrepit life. And it's interesting that Jesus would really make a point of that in the 9th chapter of the Gospel of John, because it begins this way in verse 1. It says, "As he went along," speaking of Jesus, "he saw a blind man from birth." Now, in the mind of the Jews, this guy obviously was under the bane of God, that he would be born blind. And it says his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Now think about that. He's in his mother's womb. Who sinned? Did he sin in his mother's womb? Well, there's some people who actually hold that theology, but nonetheless. But Jesus' response is so important here. He says, neither. In other words, his blindness had nothing to do with sin. This man or his parents, neither one sinned. But this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. In other words, Jesus was essentially saying he was born blind so at this moment I could come and heal him and be used as a testimony to the glory of God. And that's one thing we have to understand, is that in God's good plan for our life, he will allow some not good things to come into our life that he might demonstrate his grace, his power, his love, his mercy, his miracles in a way that would give glory to the name of God. How that expresses itself, how God gains his glory in those moments, is really up to him and not up to us. But nonetheless, we should live with that expectation that good is going to come out of even very difficult thing. But another thing we don't ever find is we never find being wealthy as being identified as a condition of sin automatically. But rather it talks very clearly in Scripture about how our wealth should be handled. For example, in 1 Timothy 6:17, Paul writes the following. He says, command those who are rich in this present world. In this present world, in other words, they have financial wealth, not to be arrogant or to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up for themselves treasures as a firm foundation for the coming age, or we would say treasures in heaven, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. So not only do they store up rewards for them in heaven by being generous and giving and ministering from their excess, but also they begin to really find the real fulfillment of life. Because Jesus put it very simply, as he's quoted in the book of Acts, it's more blessed to give than it is to receive. Many people are in fact, they're caught up in the idea that somehow to give puts them in danger. And we'll talk about this next or tomorrow when we discuss the issue of the deception of wealth. But one of the things that's so important for us to understand that it's not wrong to prosper. It's not even wrong to want to prosper. Some people feel like if I desire to become successful and grow economically, that somehow I'm in sin. I don't see any biblical basis for saying that. But it's really something that God is more concerned with. He's not only concerned with our external prospering, but also he wants us to prosper in our souls. In fact, I love the way that John put it in his third letter, in the second verse. He says this, "Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in every way." I mean, that kind of covers it. Financially, physically, emotionally, relationally, spiritually. In every way, I want you to prosper. I want your life to be, in other words, blessed. That your body, he said, may stay well, that you'll keep healthy, even as I know your soul keeps well and prospers. In fact, I greatly rejoiced when some of the brethren from time to time arrived and spoke so highly of the sincerity and the fidelity of your life, as indeed you do live in the truth. I have no greater joy than this, than to hear that my spiritual children are living in the truth. It's one of my favorite passages, actually. But the idea is that God's looking at you and he just wants to bestow his blessing and his goodness on you. There's many of us who think that God's only happy with me when I'm suffering. And there is a certain suffering that God brings into our life because he has to teach us how to be content in all things that Paul writes about into the Philippians. But also there's a suffering that is there because of our own willfulness and disobedience. That's why in Proverbs, Solomon said, in the day of adversity, stop and consider. He said, in the day of prosperity, rejoice. Give thanks. God, thank you for this largesse. Thank you for this blessing. Thank you for giving me this increase. Followed by the question, so what do you want me to do with it? Because it's not mine. It's something entrusted to me. I'm a steward. It's not my possession. But he said the danger is that sometimes when things go really wrong in our life or seem to be on a negative flow, we need to step back and say, God, what is happening? Are you teaching me to trust you in adversity? Or is this the consequence of some willful disobedience in my life that I just haven't confronted yet or been willing to admit? That becomes so critical, and it becomes oftentimes the key growth points for most of us in our Christian journey. Well, again, I'm out of time, so I'll wrap it up here. But I just tell you, I really want you to give some thought to that passage. In the day of adversity, consider. In the day of prosperity, rejoice. But in the day of adversity, consider. We'll pick it up tomorrow on that next side. See you then.